In the wet fields of Western Ireland, in the middle of the 1840s, farmers walked out at dawn expecting to dig up food and found the earth breathing rot. The leaves that had been green only days before had collapsed into black slime. The stems hung like burned string. When men pushed their spades into the soil, the potatoes came up soft, foul and useless, as if hunger had entered the ground before it entered the house. This was not a war over gold, oil, land or kings. It was a catastrophe built around a crop so ordinary today that we barely look at it before dropping it into a shopping basket. A potato can become fries beside a burger, chips in a bag, mash on a plate, vodka in a glass, starch in paper, glue, packaging, and even research for feeding humans beyond Earth. But before it became comfort food, the potato became survival. Before it became survival, it became suspicion. And before Europe ever learned to fear it, indigenous farmers in the Andes had spent thousands of years turning a poisonous mountain plant into one of the most powerful foods in human history. That is the strange tension at the center of the potato. It was ignored by conquerors, mocked by priests, banned by officials, promoted by kings, guarded like treasure, blamed for disease, forced onto peasants, and eventually trusted by millions who had nothing else between their children and starvation. It helped empires march, helped populations explode, helped factories feed workers, and then, when disease struck one fragile variety in one desperate country, it helped expose a political system willing to let people die while food still left the ports. The potato looks humble because it hides its power underground. It does not shine like sugar, travel like spice, or perfume a room like coffee. It sits in darkness, swelling quietly beneath the soil, almost invisible until harvest. That is exactly why it changed the world. It could grow where grain failed. It could feed more people from less land. It could survive cold, wind, and thin mountain air. A lumpy tuber small enough to fit in one hand became large enough to rearrange farms, cities, armies, migrations, and memory. If you like stories where ordinary food turns into empire, trade, obsession, and hidden history, subscribe to Food Empire's History. Now, to understand how potatoes became this powerful, we have to go back to where the story really begins. Long before Irish fields turned black, long before European kings argued about peasant diets, long before anyone imagined a French fry, the potato belonged to the high Andes. Picture a landscape above the clouds where thin air cuts the lungs, wind scrapes across stone, and farms cling to mountainsides that seem too steep for human hunger. In what is now Peru and Bolivia, wild potato plants grew scattered among rocks, grasses, and cold streams, far from the soft fields where Europeans later expected food to behave politely. These first potatoes were not the smooth golden tubers stacked in modern supermarkets. Many were small, knotted, bitter, and dangerous. Some were hardly larger than walnuts. Their skins could be dark purple, brown, red, or mottled like stones. Their taste could bite back. Wild potatoes contained natural defensive compounds that protected the plant from insects and grazing animals, but those same compounds could make human beings sick. The earliest people who experimented with them were not simply discovering a convenient vegetable. They were negotiating with a plant that could feed them or hurt them depending on how well they understood it. That detail matters more than it seems. Agriculture is often told as if humans found friendly plants waiting to be harvested. The potato was not friendly. It had to be studied, tested, selected, punished by frost, washed by streams, and slowly remade. Andean communities learned that water could draw bitterness away. They learned that freezing nights and bright mountain mornings could transform texture and safety. They learned that a tuber left outside in the cold, then thawed under the sun, then pressed by human feet, could become something lighter, safer, and more durable. This was not chemistry written in books, but it was chemistry. It was knowledge carried in hands, weather, memory, and repetition. Families watched which tubers made people sick and which ones filled the stomach without pain. Farmers saved the milder plants, replanted the useful ones, and rejected the bitter ones. Season after season, generation after generation, they bred less poison and more starch into a crop that could live where most crops could not. The result was not one potato, it was a universe of potatoes. Over centuries, Andean farmers developed varieties for different elevations, soils, seasons, and uses. A potato for a wet valley was not the same as a potato for a high frost line. A potato boiled for supper was not the same as one dried for storage. A potato with purple flesh, a yellow skin, or a strange twisted shape might look odd to a modern buyer trained by supermarket uniformity. But in the Andes, that diversity was security. Every shape was a possible answer to hunger. By the time the Inca Empire rose across Western South America, the potato was no longer just a mountain food, it was an imperial technology. The Inca world stretched over deserts, peaks, valleys, forests, and roads that climbed into air so thin that every journey was a test of endurance. Maize had ceremonial importance, and quinoa had strength of its own. But in the cold highlands, the potato was the crop that could make settled life possible. Terraces carved into mountainsides held soil in place. Channels guided water. Farmers planted tubers into land that looked impossible from a distance, and the empire learned to harvest calories from the edge of survival. The Inca did not treat the potato as a simple vegetable. They built systems around it. Storehouses stood along imperial roads, filled with food for soldiers, workers, messengers, and officials. Armies moving through the Andes needed supplies that would not spoil quickly. Cities needed insurance against bad seasons. Travelers needed portable food that weighed little and carried strength. Fresh potatoes were useful, but fresh potatoes rot. The Inca answer was one of the most brilliant food technologies ever created. They made chuño. After harvest, potatoes were spread across open ground at high altitude where freezing nights turned them hard. In the morning, as the sun returned, families pressed them underfoot to squeeze out moisture. The cycle continued over several days, frost by night, pressure by day, until the tubers became pale, dry, light, and durable. What had been moist and perishable became a stored food that could last for years. In a landscape where a failed harvest could mean death, chuño was not a recipe, it was a reserve of time. This is where the potato became more than food, it became planning, it became insurance, it became state power. A government that can store food can move armies, organize labor, survive drought, and command distance. A road without supply is only a path. A road lined with storehouses becomes an empire. When Inca messengers ran across mountain roads and soldiers crossed high passes, dried potatoes traveled with them, carrying the cold memory of the terraces into the machinery of rule. Then the Spanish arrived and almost completely missed the point. In the 16th century, conquistadors entered the Andes looking for metal, not tubers. They saw silver, gold, forced labor, tribute, and territory. They saw mountains as mines and people as subjects. The potato, which had taken indigenous farmers millennia to create and an empire to organize, looked to many Europeans like poor people's food. It was dirty, plain, and easy to underestimate. That mistake would shape the next chapter of its history. Some potatoes crossed the Atlantic with Spanish sailors and administrators. They entered Europe quietly, not as a treasure displayed in royal courts, but as a curiosity, a ship provision, a hospital food, a botanical specimen. Sailors valued foods that could last on long voyages and help keep bodies alive at sea. Monasteries and hospitals sometimes grew the strange new plant for the sick or the poor. But Europe did not greet the potato as a miracle. Europe looked at it with suspicion. To understand that suspicion, you have to enter a European field before modern agriculture. Wheat, barley, rye, and oats grew upward into light. Grain became bread, and bread carried religious, social, and economic meaning. Bread was not just food, it was order. It was rent, tax, wages, prayer, and class. A society built around bread did not easily accept a food that grew underground, hidden in darkness, covered in dirt, with strange little eyes staring from its skin. The potato also had bad relatives. Botanically, it belonged to the nightshade family, a group that included plants Europeans already feared, and that association helped turn caution into rumor. Potatoes were accused of causing leprosy, lust, swelling, moral weakness, and spiritual danger. Some religious critics objected that the crop did not appear in the Bible, as if a vegetable needed scripture before it could enter a pot. In elite gardens, the white and purple flowers could be admired, even worn as decoration, while the tuber itself remained beneath respectable taste. Europe accepted the blossom before it accepted the meal. For nearly 2 centuries, the potato remained trapped between usefulness and contempt. It fed animals, sailors, prisoners, hospital patients, and desperate people at the edge of the food system. The poor could eat it when bread was scarce, but that only confirmed its low status. In a society where food announced your place in the world, eating potatoes could feel like admitting defeat. Bread was civilization, potatoes were mud. But hunger has a way of humiliating prejudice. As European populations grew and wars repeatedly destroyed grain harvests, rulers began to notice what peasants resisted. Grain stood above ground and could be burned, trampled, taxed, stolen, and ruined. Potatoes hid below ground. They could produce large harvests from small plots, grow in poor soil, and avoid the mills and ovens that made grain part of a larger system. To a poor family, that meant survival. To a king, it meant a stronger population. To an army, it meant food an enemy might not see. In Prussia, Frederick the Great understood the military logic. His kingdom sat in a violent European chessboard where wars could turn fields into ash. If enemy soldiers burned wheat, people starved. But if food was buried beneath the soil, an invading army could march over dinner without noticing it. Frederick pushed his subjects to plant potatoes, sometimes with threats, sometimes with persuasion, and, according to legend, with theatre. He is said to have guarded a royal potato field by day, making the crop look valuable, then left it loosely protected at night so peasants could steal the plants and grow them themselves. Whether every detail of that story is perfect history or royal folklore, the lesson is clear. The potato needed marketing before peasants would trust it. It had to be made desirable, not merely useful. A king could order a crop into the ground, but he could not easily order appetite into a culture. Suspicion had to be turned into curiosity. Shame had to be turned into value. In Prussia, pressure, war, and hunger slowly did what logic alone could not. In France, the potato found its greatest advocate in Antoine-Augustin Parmentier, a pharmacist who had been held prisoner during the 7 Years' War and fed potatoes by his Prussian captors. The important part was simple: he survived. More than that, he came home convinced that France had been foolish to fear a crop that could help feed the poor. Parmentier became a one-man campaign for the potato, using science, status, and spectacle with unusual brilliance. He held dinners where potatoes appeared in course after course. He gave blossoms to the royal court. He appealed to physicians, officials, and fashionable society. He understood that food does not become accepted by nutrition alone. It needs a story. It needs permission. It needs someone important enough to make ordinary people reconsider what they think is beneath them. When potato flowers appeared near royalty and potato dishes appeared at elite tables, the crop began to move from the margins toward the center. This is where the potato stopped being merely a crop and became an argument. Was food supposed to honor tradition or feed bodies efficiently? Was a plant suspicious because it came from conquered indigenous lands, or valuable because indigenous farmers had already proven its power? Could a society built around bread make room for something that looked like poverty but behaved like abundance? Europe argued with the potato for generations, and hunger eventually won. The most dramatic test came in Ireland. There, the potato did not become fashionable. It became the thin wall between life and death. Under British rule, much Irish land was owned by Protestant landlords, many of them distant from the tenants who worked the soil. Irish Catholic families were pushed onto small plots, often on marginal land, with limited security and few choices. The potato fit that harsh system. With terrifying perfection, it could feed many people from little land, grow in wet conditions, and produce calories where grain struggled. For a poor tenant family with a small patch of earth, the potato was not a side dish. It was the main architecture of survival. A spade, seed potatoes, rain and labor could produce enough food to keep a family alive. Add milk or buttermilk, and the diet could sustain bodies far better than outsiders might expect. Children grew, families expanded, villages filled, Ireland's population rose dramatically, and the potato was the crop underneath that growth. But abundance had a trap inside it. Much of the rural poor came to depend on one dominant variety, the Irish lumper. It grew well, yielded heavily, and fit the conditions of poverty. Yet genetic sameness is a silent danger. A field with many varieties is like a crowd with many immune systems. A field of one variety is like one enormous plant repeated across the countryside. If a disease can kill one, it can kill all. That is exactly what happened when potato blight reached Ireland. The organism that caused it thrived in cool, wet weather. It moved through fields with frightening speed, turning healthy plants into blackened collapse and tubers into rot. For families who had grain stores, livestock, savings, or alternative crops, a failed potato harvest was a crisis. For families whose entire food supply sat under those plants, it was a sentence. The horror was not only that the crop failed, it failed again. The first year broke confidence. The next failures broke bodies. People who had lived on potatoes watched the one food they understood vanish beneath their hands. They dug through rotten ridges, hoping to salvage anything. They sold tools, clothes, animals, and furniture. They entered workhouses already weakened by hunger. Disease followed malnutrition through crowded rooms and along roads where people walked because staying home meant waiting for death. And yet Ireland was not simply empty of food. That is the moral wound at the center of the famine. While people starved, other foods continued to move through markets and ports. Grain, livestock, butter, and other goods left the island because property, contracts, prices, and imperial policy did not stop just because the poor were dying. Relief came too slowly, too conditionally, too often wrapped in suspicion of the very people who needed it. The potato blight was natural. The scale of suffering was political. The Great Famine killed roughly 1 million people and drove about another million to emigrate. Ships carried desperate passengers across the Atlantic and to British cities, Canada, Australia, and beyond. Some vessels were so crowded and diseased that they became known in memory as coffin ships. Families left with names, grief, and anger, often arriving in places where they were met with poverty and prejudice all over again. But migration is never only disappearance. Irish communities reshaped the cities they entered. In Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Liverpool, Glasgow, Toronto, Melbourne, and many other places, famine refugees and their descendants built neighborhoods, churches, labor networks, political machines, and cultural memory. The famine did not stay in Ireland. It traveled in accents, songs, votes, surnames, bitterness, and longing. A disease of potatoes became a turning point in the Atlantic world. The strange part is that the famine did not end the potatoes' rise. Instead, it changed the lesson. The world did not decide that potatoes were useless. It learned that dependency without diversity is dangerous. Breeders, farmers, and governments began paying more attention to resistant varieties, seed quality, plant disease, and agricultural science. The potato remained too productive to abandon. Its tragedy became evidence of its importance. Across Russia, the potato fought another long battle. Officials promoted it, peasants resisted it, and distrust sometimes turned violent because a state order to plant an unfamiliar crop looked less like help and more like control. But pressure, reform, and necessity carried the tuber deeper into rural life until it earned a nickname that revealed its final victory. It became the second bread. In China, India, and the highlands of East Africa, the same pattern appeared in different landscapes. The potato arrived through trade, empire, missionaries, and agricultural programs, then proved itself where rice, wheat, or other staples could struggle. In Chinese mountain provinces, it filled difficult soils with calories. In India, it entered curries, breads, snacks, and street food until it tasted native to millions. In East African highlands, it helped small farmers produce more food on limited land. Again and again, where land was difficult and hunger was close, the potato became a tool. Then industry discovered what peasants had known for centuries. Potatoes were cheap, flexible, filling, and endlessly transformable. Once cities grew and workers needed affordable meals, potatoes fit the industrial age with almost suspicious ease. They could be boiled in crowded homes, fried by street vendors, mashed in institutions, shipped in sacks, stored in cellars, and turned into products that were faster, saltier, crispier, and more profitable than the raw tuber itself. The French fry turned the potato into a global pleasure machine. Whether its deepest roots belong more to Belgium or France, the important transformation came when fried potato strips left local kitchens and entered restaurants, frozen food, fast food, and global branding. A crop that once kept Andean armies alive now came golden from deep fryers in paper sleeves, paired with burgers sold at stadiums, served to children, and engineered for consistency across continents. The potato chip did something even more radical. It turned a heavy underground crop into a light, crackling, portable habit. Thin slices, hot oil, salt, bags, shelves, vending machines, convenience stores, parties, lunchboxes, road trips. The chip made the potato audible. Once flavor powders, industrial fryers, and distribution networks entered the story, the potato was no longer only feeding people, it was competing for attention. This is where the machine did what empires had tried to do for centuries. It made desire cheap. A farmer harvested sacks of potatoes from soil. A factory washed, peeled, sliced, blanched, fried, froze, seasoned, or bagged them. Trucks carried them to warehouses. Supermarkets stacked them under bright lights. Fast food chains demanded varieties that produced the right length, color, sugar level, and texture. The potato became standardized down to the way it browned in oil. Modern consumers rarely see that system. They see fries arriving hot, chips opening with a hiss of air, frozen hash browns sliding onto a pan, potato starch hiding inside labels, instant mash waiting in a box, and bags of identical brown tubers under fluorescent light. The potato looks natural because it is familiar, but behind that familiarity sits breeding storage science, cold chains, fertilizers, irrigation, contracts, processing plants, seed certification, disease monitoring, and global price pressure. And potatoes are not only eaten. Potato starch thickens sauces, binds foods, coats paper, strengthens textiles, helps make adhesives, and appears in biodegradable materials. Potato derivatives can be found in pharmaceuticals, cosmetics, animal feed, and industrial processes. In parts of Europe, potatoes also became vodka, turning stored starch into alcohol, trade, taxes, celebration, and sometimes addiction. The same plant that kept mountain families alive could become a drink in a tavern, a chemical in a factory, or a hidden ingredient in a package. The potato even left Earth. In the space age, scientists tested it as a crop for future long-duration missions because the old strengths still mattered. It can produce dense calories, it can grow efficiently, it offers useful nutrients, it can adapt to controlled environments. The thought is almost absurd, but it makes historical sense. The crop that survived thin air in the Andes may help human beings imagine food systems beyond this planet. That is the long arc of the potato. From a bitter wild plant on high slopes to indigenous science, Inca storehouses, Spanish indifference, European fear, royal persuasion, Irish dependency, famine, migration, industry, fast food, and space research. Each age looked at the potato and saw what it needed. The Andean farmer saw survival in frost. The Inca official saw storage. The Spanish conqueror saw almost nothing. The Irish tenant saw life itself. The factory owner saw volume. The scientist saw calories for the future. And the next time you see a potato, that is what sits beneath the skin. Not just starch, not just comfort. A potato carries mountain weather, indigenous invention, imperial roads, royal tricks, famine graves, migrant ships, factory oil, supermarket light, and the uneasy lesson that the foods that save us can also make us vulnerable when power, poverty, and sameness close around them. Maybe that is why the potato feels so ordinary. It has been absorbed into daily life so completely that its history has almost disappeared. We mash it without thinking of terraces. We salt fries without thinking of famine. We open a bag of chips without thinking of farmers breeding one variety for one perfect industrial shape. We call it simple because the complicated parts happened before it reached our plate. But the potato was never simple. It was a poisonous mountain survivor remade by human patience. It was an imperial food hidden under soil. It was a rejected stranger that became a second bread. It was a life raft for the poor and a warning about what happens when survival depends on one fragile system. It became comfort food, factory product, global commodity, and maybe one day the first familiar crop in an unfamiliar world. If this story changed the way you see potatoes, subscribe for more hidden food histories. And the next time you hold one in your hand, heavy with soil or cleaned for a supermarket shelf, remember what it really is. Not a humble vegetable, but one of history's quiet engines, a buried force that fed empires, exposed cruelty, moved millions, and proved that sometimes the most powerful things in the world grow in the dark.